That is the core of Marx's philosophy, historical materialism. Actually, the words themselves, Marx never used them. Marx never called it historical materialism. It was coined later, but it actually describes it pretty well. Historical materialism, meaning philosophy of history and theory of economics based on materialistic conception of reality and causation. Materialism. Enough of ideas, he says. Let's look at actual things, at the physical world. The claims that human beings are rooted in nature and no other causal factors are at work in the world beyond physical laws and human activity. We as humans make decisions, and there are physical laws such as law of gravity and so on. That's all. He says that is what matters. He rejects any spiritual dimension of reality, be it what Plato was talking about, Descartes, or Hegel. Marxian dialectic is somewhat more simplified than Hegelian. This is where we actually are going to see this thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. But he thinks that with Hegel, the problem was turned upside down. This mystical view that this is ideas, this is thoughts. Instead, Marx says the ideal world is nothing more than the material world as reflected in human consciousness. We do, of course, have ideas in our head, but they are based on reality, not the other way around. This is a quote. He says, "The mystification which dialectic suffers in Hegel's hand by no means prevents him from being the first to present its general form of working in a comprehensive and conscious manner. With him, however, it's standing on its head. It must be turned right side up again if you would discover the rational kernel within this mystical shelf." So with Hegel, we all talk about ideas, ideas, ideas. He's saying, no, it is about material things. It's not about ideas. Economic interpretation of history. The ideas play at best a subsidiary role in causing historical changes. People cannot eat ideas, but must live in material products of labor. Hence, the economic conditions are the base on which human history is built. We first of all need to eat, we need to survive, we need to have shelter, we need to have clothing, and only after that comes the idea, not the other way around. So the key elements which he introduces in his system, that actually was in the reading. Did you guys try to do the reading? Marx is a little difficult, but it is nonetheless very, very interesting. So today we will talk about the same thing, it's just in a slightly, I guess, more clear way. But it's important to read the primary sources to see what the philosopher himself was saying. So this is the three most important elements there. Forces, powers of production. That would include means of production and human labor. Means of production, natural resources, tools, machines. So in order to produce something, you need certain tools. And of course, you also need human power, because somebody should be making it. Throughout history, those were different, right? So let's go at the very beginning of humankind. What were the first tools human beings used? Did you ever go to like these museums of history or something? Archaeology, yeah.
Like sharp rocks and stuff?
Sharp rocks, yeah. That's one of the first things they figured out. If you take a rock, make it very sharp, it becomes a tool. You can cut trees with it, kill animals, stuff like this. Very primitive, but they got some tools. Obviously, as time evolved, the more and more sophisticated tools were invented. Today, of course, we use very sophisticated tools. If you work at a factory, they have all these machines and so on. But they nonetheless are tools by themselves. They mean nothing. You need human labor too, to a different degree. In primitive society, you needed a lot of human labor. Now you don't need as much because machines do a lot of heavy work, but you still need humans at the very least to take care of those machines. to program them so they would know what to do, and frequently even that is not enough. So this is the forces of production. Then there are relations of production, he says. Relations of production is what happens between human beings as a result of that. Human beings become bosses, engineers, architects, based on this stuff. How many architects do you think they had in those prehistoric societies when they had sharp rocks? Zero, because they didn't need an architect. They were not building anything sophisticated enough for an architect to be involved, and they simply didn't have knowledge like this. But today, even if you want to build a simple house, like all the houses here in Las Vegas, suppose you want to build a house. Well, guess what? You need an architect. You cannot just get a bunch of rocks and other stuff and start building. Well, you can, but then first of all, it will probably collapse. But even if it doesn't collapse, the funny thing is you will never get a permit to live there. I don't know if you guys are aware, but once you build a house, you need the city to give you a permit. And if that was not an approved architectural design, they will not give you a permit. Why? Because the whole thing can collapse. And first of all, it can kill you, it can kill your family, and it can also kill some other people who may be passing by. So for that reason, in order to build a house, you first need to have an approved permit which tells specifically what the materials, where going to be a living room, how big, how are you going to connect all these pipes. There's so much going on there. So relations of productions, all those institutions and practices, they, according to Marx, emerge from these forces. As forces evolve, this evolves. And finally, there's what he calls superstructure. Superstructure would be legal and political system, including also art, philosophy, and so on. So this is how he thinks the whole thing looks. This is a picture from the book, and it's actually a pretty good illustration, right? The forces of production is the foundation of everything. Relations of production emerge from the forces, and this whole thing is an economic substructure. Now, on top of that, like a foam of some sort, is superstructure, which is legal and political system, art, religion, and philosophy. What does he mean by this? He means that these economic relations is what determines this, not the other way around. To him, this comes first. When we have certain forces of production, when we have technology of certain type, that determines what relations we will have. So, for example, when they had the agricultural production, when mainly people were working on land, what relations did people have? What type of relations between people were prevalent? Even in this country, say 200 years ago. It wasn't very industrial, right? But we got a lot of agriculture in the south. So what type of relations did they have? Anybody know? Between people, like in terms of your job, like, okay, when you come to your work, your relation to your co-workers, maybe you could be their boss, right? Or you could be one of the people who cuts vegetables. I think that's what you said, right? And the other people may be giving you these vegetables. So this is relations. So what type of relations between people did they have 200 years ago in agricultural society? What were these people doing? How do you produce food?
You farm.
Okay, so they are farming. What is farming involved? We're mainly now talking about more forces, but that affects the relation. So in terms of forces, how do you generally farm? What were they doing? Well, you need the soil, right? You need to put some seeds into the soil. Then you need to collect it. Based on that, though, what relations did people have among themselves? Okay, let me just answer it for you. Slavery. We got slavery. Hello, there were slaves and slave owners. Some people were owners of the slave. They didn't do anything. Other people were slaves and they did all this work. And that's how they related to each other. That's the relation, right? If you're a slave owner and somebody is a slave, you have a relation in that you tell them what to do and they do what you tell them to do, and not the other way around. Of course, in industrial society, that doesn't exist. So Marx actually was well aware of this process. That happened during his lifetime, and he says, well, that is because this changes. The forces of production change. At the factory, you don't have this type of relation because it's actually not efficient to have slaves at the factory. Industrial production calls for a different relation, whereas the capitalist simply pays you wages. You are free to take the job or not to take the job, but you need to survive, so you take this job. Once you take this job, again, the relations of production would be what? There would be bosses who would tell you what to do, and you would be a worker who is doing what you are told by these bosses. You're not their slave. You can work wherever you want. It's just that, where are you going to go? What are you going to eat? You need to survive. You don't have any money. So that would be a different type of relations. And what Marx is saying is that all this legal system, political system, emerges from that. So Marx would say, why did, for example, United States get rid of slavery? The typical answer is, like, Americans realized that slavery is not good. Marx would say, no, it's because the society became more industrial, so it was no longer profitable. And since it was no longer profitable, and note that which states were actually abolitionists, which states were against slavery? Northern states, which were more industrial, and which states still even today feel nostalgic for slavery? Southern states, which are more agricultural. So that's what Marx is trying to say here. And based on this, that affects art, religion, and philosophy. That affects how people think. That's why more people in the South are still kind of nostalgic over these good old days of slavery, and they are voting for Republicans. But more people who are closer connected to more modern society and live in states with large industrial base, such as New York, for example, they are more liberal. So that is one of the key ideas that Marx has. He calls it economic and technological determinism. So basically, economic determinism is the idea that economic structure of society determines its legal, political, and cultural forms. Right? Depending on the state of the economy, what is happening with the economy, that determines what laws we have, what system of government we have. Because for capitalism, it seems like democratic system is the most efficient, and it seems like, for example, this nobility system based on privilege of the certain classes is no longer useful. Why is it no longer useful? Well, because in capitalism, what kind of people become rich? Is it only noble people? No. As soon as capitalism emerged, it became clear that people who are more successful are not necessarily nobles. They are just sometimes may have been poor before, but they just very skillful at that kind of business. They know how to conduct business. So a lot of people who were not noble started becoming wealthy. That was actually very, very significant during especially like 17th, 18th centuries, early days of industrialization, when suddenly, prior to that, only noble people had all the money, and the poor people didn't have any money. And then suddenly you started getting people who are not noble, they are not like barons or something, and yet they have more money than those barons. And it was becoming more and more prominent. So they started getting some political influence. Because if you have money, even if you don't have the name which goes back centuries, but if you have money, you can influence politics, right? So this is why the system started to change more towards democracy, because at that point, it no longer mattered who's your family, how many centuries did they serve the king, and so on. What became more important is how successful you personally are, and it seems like it's more open to everybody being successful. But there is also another part which is technological determinism. He says, how developed is your economy depends on your technology. All these machines, they don't grow out of the ground, right? Who makes those machines? People. So if you actually know how to make better machines, if you're more advanced, then that changes the forces of production. That in turn changes relations of production, and that in turn changes philosophy, art, political system, and so on. So what exactly is ideology in all of this? Well, ideology actually is what Marx thinks is a type of self-deception. In fact, he's not a fan of ideology. The superstructure, art, philosophy, politics, and so on, represents all the ways in which people in a particular age tend to think of themselves and think of their activities. Think who they are and what are they doing. However, the way in which people think and speak of themselves is not always consistent with what they are and what they do. Right? We could deceive ourselves, and that is, in psychology, they actually call it rationalization. So if you know, what is a rationalization? In terms of the individual, what happens with individual when you employ rationalization? Does anybody know? Like, there are so many psychology majors. You must have heard it at least once. Well, I can give you an example of rationalization from my life. Right? I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but when you grow older, around the age 45, your vision is actually starting to go back. Up until that point, I had a perfect vision all my life. And I love books. I used to read a lot of books all the time. Then I noticed that it actually started harder for me to read them, so I started thinking that I prefer electronic books. Why did I prefer electronic books? Because it's easier to read. In electronic, you can increase the size, right? And you don't need glasses or anything like this. Well, that continued for a while, and I honestly thought electronics books are better. And then, actually, my wife suggested that I try reading glasses, which I use all the time now. In case if you don't know, reading glasses are something you only can use to see up close. When I look at the distance, I don't need them, which is why I usually don't use them. In fact, they actually make it hard for me to see in the distance. But up close, I need them. As soon as I put it, I was like, oh my God, I can actually read it very well. And guess what happened? I went back to reading books. Because I was deceiving myself. I was thinking that electronic books, I prefer them because they are generally better, but I was preferring them because I could no longer read regular books. I was lying to myself. And that's rationalization. This is what happens with people all the time. If the circumstance is not allowing you to do something, you tend to deceive yourself thinking, I don't even want it. In fact, it's better without it. It's excellent. Like, another example could be if your, I don't know, boyfriend broke up with you, right? You feel bad about it, but then you tell yourself, I don't even need a boyfriend. In fact, I don't want any man. I'll be like single person now, right? That's some rationalization. So the point Marx is trying to make, the same thing happens with society overall. A society tries to explain everything which is happening within this society in a positive way, even if it is something bad. And that is rationalization. And that's what he called ideology. So rationalization would be on a group level as well as on the individual level. When individual people rationalize their own behavior as a group, they rationalize the behavior of their society in order to maintain or justify the current social system. To tell themselves, no, 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 it's a great system. This is how things should be. Even though they feel unhappy, they feel uncomfortable about it. Because they don't really want to change anything. It seems like change is such a hard thing to do. And it's just easier to convince yourself that things are fine. There's no big deal. It's okay. So that is the type of false consciousness which Marx calls ideology. So ideologies, according to Marx, are cultural expressions that represent society's self-understanding and can represent a distorted view of reality. Whether ideology could be something positive, well, Marx didn't actually think so. Although his own system frequently called ideology these days, right? But he didn't think of his system as ideology. He only thought ideologies would be like this self-deceptions. So to Marx, ideology is always a negative word, and the part which actually you read is from his work called German Ideology. And that's where he discusses it in more detail and talks about how the Germans deceive themselves, and that is the ideology of the German society. And why do people do that? Well, on an individual level, it could be for many reasons, because frequently we just can't change something. We don't have enough of a power to change it, and so we deceive ourselves. But society does the same thing, and sometimes it's even done deliberately when it serves to maintain and justify the power structure. So why would people who are in power try to use ideology? Well, because they like to be in power, they want to stay in power, and they realize that if you find out that there's a better way to live, you may remove them from power. And they don't want that. So of course, they create the whole system of these ideas which is meant to justify the system with them in power. So that would be the ideology. Now he looks at the entire history in terms of class struggle. Different classes. This is a quote: "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guild master and journeyman, in a word, the oppressor and the oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstruction of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes." So he says throughout history it was always the case. And it is again this master-slave type of confrontation which Hegel was talking about. Remember, we discussed it with Hegel, so Marx also read it, and he thinks that is happening in a society between different classes of people, because like in a slave-owning society there are slaves, which is a group of people, and there are owners, which is a different group of people. And of course it's not in the interest of the slaves to have this system, but it is in the interest of the owners. So they try to preserve it. Similarly, even before that, like patricians and plebeians, lords and serfs, right? The lord doesn't do anything, has land, and the peasants are working for the lord. So in whose interest this system works? The interest of the lord. Do peasants benefit from it? No, of course not. But the lord must make sure that the system is preserved, and so like one of the typical ways of doing it back in medieval days was what? Religion, right? Because according to religion, especially the way they interpreted it back then, God created some people as masters and other people as their servants. And so if you don't want to be a servant, if you want to be a master, that means you are against God. God made you a servant. So who are you to contradict God? Just wait till you die. Then you'll go to paradise. Don't worry for now. Just work. Just do your job. In whose interest do you think it worked? In the interest of the lords, in the interest of the kings. Of course, if the king is the king, he doesn't want you to question how good he is at his job, right? He wants you to just do whatever you are told. But you don't want to do whatever you are told. Maybe you're thinking your king is the idiot. Well, there's a convenient way to convince you. God decided he should be the king. Who are you to question God? Do your job. Don't question God. So if God wants to, he can give you a heart attack or something. It's not your job. So you see, and then addition to that is like, well, when we die, then the kings actually will all be punished for their bad deeds. You will be embarrassed. So religion, as well as philosophy and even art, according to Marx, simply serve to preserve this system. They serve the function of trying to dull people's pain, explain to people that everything is the way it's supposed to be, and convince them not to change anything at all. Because people who are in power don't want any changes. And during the capitalism, he says, the biggest division became bourgeoisie and proletariat. Bourgeoisie would be not just people who own production, although mainly those are people who own production, who own those factories, but also people who are benefiting in some other way, like politicians, for example. So all those people are in confrontation with proletariat, and proletariat literally means propertyless people, people who are on the bottom, the poor people. And they are the ones who actually produce everything because they are the ones who work. They do all the job, and those other people basically are parasites which are benefiting from their labor. His most famous work, Capital, explains in breathtaking details how it happens, how the worker works extra time in order for their capitalist to exploit him, take away some of his labor and benefit from that. And of course, if you have a lot of workers, if you have millions of people work for you, and you take a little bit from each one of them, then you have a lot. And that a lot allows you to live this lavish lifestyle and have all these benefits which you otherwise don't deserve. However, Marx thinks that the only people who deserve everything are people who labor, who create things with their hands, with their minds, who actually do something. So the name bourgeoisie initially just meant townsman. Burg means a town in German. So that's where it came. Proletarian, like I said, propertyless. It's actually a Latin word. Now, ideology, he says, is always a product of the dominant class. Whichever class is in control, that's the class who creates ideology. And of course, those are also people who control newspapers, who control mass media, and so on. And those are people who then are able to, well, you may say, brainwash you into thinking that things are fantastic. The ideas of the ruling class, he says, in every epoch are the ruling ideas. The class which has the means of material production at their disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production. So the same people who own factories, who own the capital, they also own the newspapers and the TV stations and so on. So they are capable of creating this mass production. The way it typically works is, of course, they don't tell journalists what to say, right? But journalists know what they're supposed to say if they want the job. Because there's obviously some editorial restrictions and so on. And if you are, especially like on a high level journalist who works at mass media or something, you can say whatever you want. But if you know what you'll be saying your boss is not going to like and you can get fired for this, would you then be saying those things? No. Obviously, you will not. Just one interesting thing which I still can't quite get over, the amount of money people make, the people who are on television and so on. Like all those newscasters and so on. I don't know if you guys know. Do you know how much they're making? Like, for example, there's the Good Morning America program, right? There's Stephanopoulos there. What's her name? This other lady. Their typical pay is $20, $30 million a year. $30 million a year. So now think about, for this much money, if you are told to say something and you don't want to lose your job, would you say it? No, but I mean, you wouldn't say it. But if your editor tells you, I think, today in the program, you should probably say something good about this person, would you then say, no, I don't think so. I don't like that at all. Because their contract, actually annual contract, it's not like they have lifetime job. Every year they renew it, and they don't have to renew it. In fact, they change periodically. They actually can say, okay, you know what? We no longer think it's working. So goodbye. And that is insane amount of money. It's insane amount, right? You work there for 10 years, you work there 10 years, $300 million. That is absolutely crazy amount of money. And this is information which actually has been available. It is not a secret. So that is how the whole thing works. Intellectuals, Marx thinks, always serve those in power. Because all those intellectuals are interested in their jobs, they're interested to be hired to write and so on. And for this reason, they themselves know what they're supposed to say. So there's like this self-control in a sense. You don't want to say things which you don't think will give you a job, which will allow you to continue with what you're doing. So he says all intellectuals in a society are active, conceptive ideologists who make the perfecting the illusions of the class about itself their chief source of livelihood. So they basically make a living out of the fact that they glorify the existing system. So ideology provides this upside-down perspective on reality. In all ideology, human beings and their circumstances appear upside down. What exactly does he mean? So this is how he says society typically views itself, right? We have certain philosophy in a society, certain ideology, and this is why we live in this way. It's certain historical change. Then our ideas change, right? There are some intellectual changes. Different philosophy gives us different society. So for example, let's say this is 200 years ago. People thought that slavery is fine. They owned slaves. That's why society had slaves. Then people decided, no, that actually is not working for us. We don't want to be slave owners. People should all be free. And they changed the society. Now that, Marx says, is fake. This is not what is really happening. What is really happening is this. We have an economic system, such as agricultural system. That's why we have this philosophy. That's why we think slavery is fine. The economic system changes. That's why we start thinking differently. So it's not that our thoughts affected the way we live. It's the way we live affected our thoughts. And the way we live changed because circumstances changed. Progress happened. We invented better means of production. We started doing all this stuff on factories instead of the field. And so that affected the relations between people. Ideas themselves within society, he says, has this natural selection. If you have an idea which is not accepted by the society overall, it will be rejected. You can think about it this way too. For example, let's say bloggers or influencers online. Can they say anything they want? What happens if they say something which their followers really don't like?
They get canceled.
They get canceled. No more money for you. And they make a lot of money out of it. So what do you think? Do they censor themselves? Do they sometimes say things which they again don't want to say, but they know that if they say what they actually want to say, they might get cancelled? Yeah, exactly. That's how it works. You don't even need a boss. You boss yourself because you know what ideas would be welcomed by people and which ideas would not. Yeah, there are occasional rebels, people who just speak their mind, but guess what? Those are the poor people. Those are the people who never make money. Because that always robs somebody the wrong way. So now we are getting to his theory of revolution. Why does he think revolution happens? Why society changes? Well, this is kind of interesting because there's a bit of a contradiction here. Remember, he called for action. He says that we should actually change the society. But in the same time, he's saying, well, there is technological determinism. We can't change the society until society is ready to be changed. And society is only ready to be changed when progress happens, when technology changes and economic system changes. So here's the reason for revolution. If again we go back to this picture, we can kind of understand it a little bit better. So this is the way society is, right? We have forces of production. But what do you think happens to this? It doesn't immediately change. Then there's a tension here. This no longer corresponds to this. And that tension is growing until a revolution happens. And when a revolution happens, then this and this changes. The revolution doesn't happen because ideology changes. It happens because this changes. And that actually explains a lot. Let's go back to where we were. At a certain stage of their development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production. So this comes into conflict with this. Or what is but a legal expression of the same thing with the property relations within which they have been at work hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters, like chains. They are no longer, because when it was here, they were working well together. When it's here, that is now holding it back. It has to change. And these types of relations, they are not that easily changed. Again, if we think about slavery, well, did people just let go of slavery and say, okay, let's just let all these slaves leave? No, they don't want to do that. And then you need some force, like the Civil War or something, to force that to come here. And then it will correspond. So this is the idea. And this is how he says it always happens, that the revolution, it's great if the society could just change peacefully, everybody agreed, but that doesn't work this way, because certain people then lose their power. They lose the position of privilege which they have, and they don't want to do that, so they're not going to give it up easily. There has to be some sort of violent change. And that happens periodically when the system changes, which is why there were revolutions in England in the 17th century, in France in the 18th century, in Russia in the 20th century, and he says that is the way it always works. There is a class conflict. These classes constantly in the power struggle. While the internal pressure of the current system is building, class and power is motivated to preserve the old order. Typically, those are conservatives, right? Why do people call themselves conservative? To conserve. What does it mean to conserve something? To preserve it. So you don't want it to change. Let's keep it the way it is. Let's make it great the way it was before. It was so fantastic before, in the 19th century, right? Why do we want to change? But things change whether you want it or not. So this is when this tension happens, when the forces of production have developed to the fullest extent possible within the existing relations of production, and all piecemeal adjustments have failed, the resulting tension will lead to class conflict culminating in social revolution, either violent or sometimes maybe not violent, but nonetheless it would be a very dramatic change. So he thinks that there are several of these historical epochs, which he, by the way, mentions in the reading. First, the primitive communal economic system, the tribal system. He talks there about the unit was the family, right? You lived with your family, you protected your family. That's unit number one. But typically, even families were collected into a tribe. It's not a large number of people. Then their technology changed. This is what led to this slave system, because the agriculture emerged. Back in the tribal system, they didn't have agriculture, they were hunting. When they started having agriculture, you really can no longer just work on a field with a tribe. You need more people. You need the bigger areas. You need more division of labor. The plows started to appear and so on. So for this, they got like more of a state type of society. Then feudal system, estate landowners emerged on as a replacement for this system. Finally, when the technology was so sophisticated that we started building factories and we had machines, this is when capitalist system has emerged. The system we still have today. But Marx says that's not going to stop there. That's where he talks about socialist communist system. So let's see how he describes this process. First of all, when he talks about capitalism, he says capitalism has the labor theory of value. Remember the labor theory of value? We mentioned it with Locke. It basically means that everything you produce, you put your labor into, that's why it costs a certain amount of money. Tree by itself doesn't cost any money, but once you cut it, once you made a table out of it, put your labor into it, now it costs some money. Worker labor is a commodity. In a capitalist society, it is just sold as a commodity. You go to a factory, you get a job, they pay you money for your labor. They tell you, all day you'll be doing this, and we will pay you this much money. Right? So your labor becomes just a commodity. But Marx says that when they do that, they don't give you the full value of your labor. If they did, they wouldn't make any profit. Profit is only possible if they exploit you. If they take more from you, then you actually, then they pay. So they have to pay you less than your labor is worth. And that's how they actually make profit. In fact, he makes an interesting point. He says, if there were no workers, just the machines, it would be impossible to make any profit. You can't make profit if your entire factory is just a machine. So you have to have at least some people work there, and you pay them wages. Then you can make profit. So when worker works at the factory, first part of the day, hours spent producing products, total value equivalent to his wages. This is what he actually earns. But then there's another part of the day when the worker still works, however, he's not paid for these hours, and that is where exploitation happens. This is what he calls surplus value. This is what capitalists extract from the workers in order to enrich themselves. So this is how the system overall develops. First, remember, this is the Hegelian idea, right? Thesis, antithesis, the system which we have today. And it was already prevalent during Marx's time. So a small class of people own and control major forces of production as their private property. People own factories, people own other means of production, and they employ workers. But there's a contradiction right there. It is within the class itself. The ideology is based on individualism, however, the growth requires highly organized social base. So you need mass of workers to work for you to produce profits, and as such, they actually seem to create this collective of people. Okay, but that by itself wouldn't be too bad. However, there is this dialectical development. In the competitive struggle for profits, machinery is produced that cannot be exploited. Source of surplus value cut off. Then what happens is outsourcing. More efficient production, fewer employers worked overproduction. The smaller companies go bankrupt, their resources become spoils of war. So what he is trying to say here, and that actually is written in the 19th century, but let's think about it. The more technology they have, the less they are capable of exploiting workers. So what is the solution to that? Why are they moving production to China? Cheaper labor. You can now employ these people so they would be working and make profit on them. But what happens if you do that? What happens to all these people who worked in a factory here in America? They lose their job. They become poor. However, the capitalist is okay. He still makes profit. It's just his factory is in China. So that's the process. The idea is, why can't they bring it back here? Well, if they bring it back here, okay, let's say, because today this is what the current issue of the day, right? If they bring back the factories here, what will happen? The worker in China, I can tell you, makes around $800 a month. Let's say you employ 1,000 people, just hypothetical number. You're spending $800,000 to pay them, and they produce product which, let's say, you are selling for $1 million. What's the profit? It's a simplified picture. How much profit do you make? You sold it for $1 million, you paid $800,000. 200,000. Okay, great. That's your profit. Now let's say you move your factory to America. Now, would somebody here work for $800 a month? No. So how much do you need to pay them here then? What's the minimum you need to pay a worker in the factory? At least 2,000 a month. Right? I don't think you can hire people for less than that. Certainly not in the factory. Okay, so now 1,000 workers would cost you what? $2 million. Well, you have a problem. Can you see the problem? You can only sell it for $1 million, but you have to pay them $2 million. What's the solution? Well, there are two solutions. One solution would be you're no longer selling it for whatever you were selling. You got to now sell it for $3 million. So the price goes 3 times. So that's why they say if they do that, Nike shoes would be $400, an iPhone $3,500. They actually calculated that. That's what it's going to cost. There's another solution. You don't pay them $2,000. You pay them $800. But there is no third solution. This is the only two solutions. You either do this or you do this. Either you employ people, pay them $2,000 a month, and then your iPhone is $3,500, or you pay them $800 a month, and you can still sell your iPhone for $1,000. What is the problem in this case? What happens if the iPhone costs $3,500? How many of you guys will buy it? Very few. It's just going to be fun for the rich, right? That also affects profits, because they can no longer then make $3 million. They can only sell maybe a lot fewer. This would be a solution now, if they pay you $800. But then what happens to you? If you work at a factory and make $800 a month, what happens? Are you happy? Are you doing well? No, but know that you don't need to do it by paying people $800 a month. There's a clever way to do it. You can pay them $2,000 a month, but it's no longer worth $2,000. It's now worth $800. That's called inflation. And that's what inflation can accomplish. You have $1,000. You go to a grocery store and you see bananas cost $10 and this costs $20. So you actually have more money, but it's less pay. But this is the only two solutions. You cannot find any other solution. Theoretically, you could have a factory with only machines, but then they will not be able to make any money. Another way to think of it, if they have a factory with only machines, what are these people going to be doing? Then people will not get any money, not even $800. They need a job. They need to do something. So this is the problem. And Marx actually did discuss it. So the consequences of development of capitalism becomes more and more monopolistic. These large corporations, they suppress small shop owners, small producers. Why? Because large corporation has a lot more means to make their product cheap, to suppress the competition. I don't know if you guys know anything about it, but have you noticed that there's more and more small businesses? Yeah, why? Because anytime there's a small business, if you talk to somebody who owns small business, what are they going to tell you? There's these large corporations which basically just price them out of existence. If you have small mom and pop shop and you sell in groceries, next to you gigantic Smiths or something opens up. Where are people going to go? To the Smiths. And it's cheaper there too, because they have a direct deals with the producers. Like if you buy tomatoes for your shop, how many tomatoes do you buy? I don't know, 50 pounds maybe a week. They buy 1 million pounds. So then they come to the farmers and say, okay, I will buy 1 million pounds, but make sure that I'm the only one who's buying it. And this little guy with his 50 pounds, don't sell him anything. If you want to sell him, charge him more. And they will agree because this is a great deal for them. Like 1 million pounds. What's this little guy? I don't care about little guy. And then little guy finds himself out of business because he can no longer afford this little mom and pop shop. But as a result, these corporations, once they get control, once they actually have all this, they can raise the price now. You no longer have any competition. There's nobody you can go to. This is not a funny thing which is happening. I don't know if you know, many of these brands, they're different brands, but they're owned by the same company. They compete with themselves. They may have different name, but it actually is the same company which owns them. So why would they compete with themselves? They don't. And as a result, the prices are higher, because once they get control, the price will definitely go up. Another interesting example I can give you is with the cell phones. I lived in UK and I was shocked how cheap it is. In UK, you know how much you pay a month for the cell phone? With roaming and everything, I paid 13 pounds. 13 pounds is about $15, $16 a month. How about here? How much are you paying here? You don't know? You're not paying anything. Your parents are paying. Well, I'm sure somebody is paying. So how much are you paying normally? Well, the minimum would be $50. $50 is like the basic plan. If you want all-inclusive, non-limit, $100. $50, I don't know if you can find cheaper than $50. So compare 16 and 50. Why? Because they actually have competition. They have several companies. We don't have any competition. We think we do, but AT&T, Verizon, and who else? Sprint, I think, all owned by the same company. They're competing with themselves. So of course they are not interested to lowering the prices. That they had enough. So that creates this proletariat. That creates a large mass of people who have nothing, who don't have a job, don't have money, but they're still human beings. So do you think they'll just give up and say, okay, I'm going to die, I don't care? No, people are not like that. At least some of them. Maybe some of them will give up, but some of them will not. And then they will rise up. And that is what he talks about, inevitability of revolution. The revolution then is inevitable. At some point, people will realize they have nothing to lose anymore, so they just take their matters into their own hands and try to overthrow all these people who are exploiting them. And that is the theory of revolution. Capitalism, he says, will have its own undoing. It's basically going to undo itself because the contradiction is right there. The antithesis is proletariat. It creates this proletariat, and as a result, it will lead to the revolution. So that's the Marxist system according to what he said. So the next, he says, socialism would be the next stage. Socialism, he describes as when workers take production into their own hands. The definition of socialism, according to Marx, is actually when workers themselves are the owners of the means of production. So factories belong to the workers, everything belongs to the workers. Workers are the ones who run things, not the capitalists. And then that will lead to communism. He actually never specifically described what communism is, except in general terms. Because he says, well, you will only know when you get there. But the idea is that under communism, people will not be working in this type of factory jobs at all. And you may say, how is this possible? Well, the idea is, of course, that the productive capacity of society will develop to the point when you can have robots doing the job. So think about it in these terms of, like, this is right now emergent. I don't know if you heard about it, but they say we will be losing our jobs very soon, all of us. Because AI already does a lot of this, and it's getting more and more advanced. The robot's going to be doing all of this. So what's the solution then? What are we going to do? So according to Marx, we can organize the society when we will be doing whatever we want. And that's communism. So basically, you may be painting, writing poetry, creating something with your hands like, I don't know, pottery, and then giving it to people for free, because you don't need to sell it. Why not? Well, because there's already so much production. Those robots are doing everything for us that we no longer need money. It seems crazy, but that's the idea, right? If everything is made by the robots and by the machines, who are you going to charge? The robots? They create stuff for you, you just go and take it. You go into a store, stuff is just standing there, you take what you want. And he also thinks that at this point we could be more disciplined, because right now, obviously, if the store told you you can come and take whatever you want, people would just stampede it in and take everything. But he thinks that you have to realize that then you're just going to destroy the store. So you just go and take what you need. And of course, what you need, like how many, for example, pairs of pants do you really need? You need like 500 pairs of pants? No. Maybe 2, 3, I don't know, 4, reasonable amount. And if you no longer need them, you can just give it back away. So that's the idea, right? How it's exactly going to work, like I said, he didn't work out all the details. But he thinks it's inevitable now. He thinks that inevitably society will get to this next stage, and there is like nothing anybody can do, simply because technology develops. And if we try to avoid it, we will fail, because indeed, like imagine, if all the production indeed done by AI and robots, what are we going to do? How is the society going to work? The only way for it to work is if we really will just enjoy ourselves to a reasonable degree, like not try to take anything away from other people, but in the same time respect them and enjoy ourselves and let them enjoy themselves. And that's the kind of an idea. No more private property of means of production. The society, this is a few things he said about communism. He said, it is the ascent of man from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. And it is freedom, right? In a sense, because you're no longer bound to go do any kind of job. Job is done by the robots. He never talked about the robots, but he still talked about the progress. And even back then, you could figure out that the progress keeps on moving. You're free to do whatever you want. And that's the true freedom. Anyway, So communism is a genuine resolution of the conflict between man and nature and between man and man. Communism is a riddle of history solved, knows itself to be this solution. So this is Marx's system, kind of in a nutshell. Is it perfect system? No, obviously there's a lot of criticism. Remember when we started the first lecture, I told you guys, he is not a saint. It's not like every word he says has to be taken like, oh, that has to be true. No, obviously there are problems with his system and so on. Nonetheless, it was enormously influential, and it still is enormously influential today, and it's important to understand it, and it tells you a lot about our society, about what is happening today with us.